Hello, Namaskar, good evening. I am Ajit Jha, the editor of the Public Global and the CEO of Power Pixar. And today I want to return back to a topic on which I made a video just yesterday, and that is uh, Donald Trump, the US President Donald Trump's tariffs, and how it changes um, geopolitics, geostrategy, and even patterns of international trade in a tectonic fashion. And what I'm going to do is, although I'll start with what President Trump did in terms of, let's say, imposition of tariffs on India, 50%, Brazil 50%, at one time against China almost 145%, but climbed down to 30%, and other countries, including Russia. But I'll focus on the broader aspect of it, the impact of that, because I've done a few videos on what sort of brought about this massive change in the tariff policy in the US after President Trump came to power, sort of almost supported by the MAGA groups. And today I'm going to talk about how this, for example, the shift, if you see his tweet, which was the day before yesterday, where he talked about, with a certain degree of finality, very un-Trump like, where he says that we have lost India to China and Russia, and that he's wishing them sort of good wishes for the future. But there is an admission of finality. There is an admission that his negotiations as if it's over. President Trump, in a very un-Trump-like fashion, because we know that President Trump is a transactional president. You know, he sort of raises the bid, he raises the pitch, and then he climbs down. But on this occasion, day before yesterday, that tweet of his kind of reflects as if America is going back to isolationism, that the BRICS, as one of his trade advisors pointed out, India is the vowel between Russia and China. I for India is the vowel between the two consonants, Russia and China. And of course, in general, the rhetoric of President Trump and his advisors against the BRIC countries goes on. So this, according to me, accelerates a process which began much before President Trump, but it accelerates it in what I would call a dramatic fashion, tectonic shift. And what is that? That is broadly termed as the decline of the West and the rise of the rest. Or if you want to put it in a more sort of formal terms, or if you want to put it in rather more, let's say, focused and narrower terms, then the decline of the G7, certainly the decline of the US, long-term historical decline, structural decline, if you want, and I'll give you certain indicators by which we will sort of show the decline and how the rise of the rest is taking place. In this, the big focus is on the BRIC countries, the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So basically, it comes down to G7 versus the BRICS. BRICS are, basically 5 countries. So G7 versus the emerging economies in the world order. Brazil from sort of Latin America, Russia, India, China from Asia. Russia is both a Eurasia power from Europe as well as Asia, and South Africa from Africa. And a long list of countries, especially in the so-called developing world, third world, if you would like, who are wanting to join the BRICS. So So this dramatic change around, as I'm saying, the rise of the West, the decline of the West, the decline of the U.S. As a hegemon. At one time, for a long, long time, the only superpower in the world. After Britain declined, the U.S. rose, and with the U.S., the entire sort of Western sort of the center of gravity of capitalism, with institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, the Bretton Woods, and sort of and multinationals, and the entire sort of Western capitalism, its rise uh, at one time declined when England declined, then the rise along with the US, and recently the decline of the US. That is what I'm going to focus on. And President Trump's tweet and President Trump's attempt to alienate India and Brazil in such a manner that they have moved very close to the BRICS. In fact, now, as we talk, just a few days ago, Prime Minister Modi, in fact, President Trump ended up tweeting a photograph where the heads of state, the heads of government of India, China, Russia were all together, during the Shanghai Cooperation sort of meet. And later on, he even sort of talked about, or the world is talking about, how sort of the Victory Day in China. So these two events became kind of center, and it's kind of highlighting this tectonic shift, as I pointed out. So Trump slapping 50% on imports from India and Brazil, two of the fastest growing economies of the world. And he did so with his trademark, what I would call a bit of bluff, a bit of bluster, and lots of bravado. And what does it portend? It portends protectionism. Trump insisted was the new patriotism. Suddenly, at one time, free trade was considered patriotism by the right wing in America, by the Republican Party. Whereas today, it's protectionism that has become the new sort of sine qua non, if you want, the new vocabulary of the right. In fact, in a very interesting comment by one of the well known left wing economists from America, Richard Wolff, who has taught at Yale and the New School of Social Research and several of the top universities, he talks about how the word globalist has become the new abuse in the right wing in America. So if you're a globalist, you're basically anti-US. If you're a globalist, you're anti the West. The globalist is, of course, everyone who is for protectionism, who is against sort of, let's say, open trade, who is against maybe what American capitalism was doing, let's say, in the last about 30 years or longer. In fact, since 1974, which is moving lots of its manufacturing base under globalization to China, to Mexico, even to India, Indonesia, and several other countries. That has become the dirty word today. And as I said, protectionism is the new patriotism under President Trump. But the unintended consequence of that, of this sort of tariff terror, some people call it, imposition of tariff, changing of the goalpost almost every other day, sometimes every other hour, sometimes every other week. Remember China from 145% to 30%. India from 25% to 50%. And the reason given, because India, as Trump's trade advisor pointed out, Peter Navarro, that India is actually bankrolling, mark his words, bankrolling the war between Russia and Ukraine. Now, think of it. A country like India, which is barely what about 4.2 trillion dollars, does India have the capacity to bankroll a war between Russia, which is a European power, perhaps one of the top global powers in the world, and Ukraine? And it's not a war between Russia and Ukraine. Actually, it's a war between NATO and Russia. In that, can a poor country like India, even though its GDP is very large, and soon it is, right now it's the fourth largest economy, soon to become the third largest economy, but that's largely because our population base is very large, right? It's about what, 140 crore, 1.4 billion. But India remains largely, let's say about 70 to 80% India is, basically largely farmers and working class. It's only the 20% in India, the middle class, which are rich. So how can a country, even the sort of the largest, one of the largest countries in the world, but we can't afford to bankroll. All India is doing is buying cheaper oil from the market. And we need to do that because we are a sort of net importer of oil in a major way. And wherever India got cheaper oil, whether it was Iran, whether it was even the US, whether it was Saudi Arabia or Russia, it went around purchasing it, and that should be the rational policy of any country. But the unintended consequence of this imposition of tariffs, or as I said, tariff threats and tariff terror, and almost tariff being used as one would call it an economic sanction. The unintended consequence of that was this tectonic shift, as I point out, in geopolitical sort of and economic, a tectonic shift. I mean, tariffs has caused massive tectonic shifts, in all kinds, not only in trade, but its impact, domestic impact in the US, for example. Domestic inflation is going crazy high. It is having a negative effect on countries like India, Brazil, and those who are facing the stick, even China to some extent. Several other countries where it has been imposed, including European powers, countries like Switzerland. But I won't broaden the focus here. I'll keep it down to the BRIC countries. And the unintended consequence of this initiative, as I point out, by President Trump, by alienating India, especially India, the world's largest democracy, and let's say Brazil, one of the largest economy and the key economy in Latin America. As a result, both India and Brazil have moved closer to China and Russia. In a way, there is a shift from India, which was very close to the US. Remember, India is still a member of the Quad. There is a meeting of the Quad scheduled by the end of the year, in which President Trump was scheduled to come, and India was supposed to be the host. And who are the four Quad countries? US, India, Japan, Australia. This was supposed to be at one time, a sort of, in a way, what one would call a group of countries trying to checkmate China. The entire policy of America, for what I would point out from since 1997, was to come closer to India and sort of checkmate China, the rise of China. Now that looks like has been put in the, at least for the time being, in the cold storage. We will see what happens at the end of the year. And as I said, bilateral negotiations between India and the US are still on when it comes to the issue of tariffs. But it seems it appears that this is shifting, especially with Mr. Modi's sort of attendance in the SCO summit in Tianjin. And it seems that the entire geopolitical shift is taking place. Now, having said that, let's take India and Brazil together, because these are the two big players that have shifted in a way. I mean, Brazil was also, part of the part of Latin America, the largest country in Latin America, in a way, after Canada and let's say the US. And Brazil at one time was very close to the US. It's only under President Lula and because of Mr. Trump that the entire rift began. And we won't go into the details of that right now. But this Washington's tariff escalation has turned a simmering irritation into a strategic reassessment, as I called it, a tectonic shift in geopolitics. Whereas China, despite the fact that it faces some kind of, let's say, a crisis in terms of international trade and other issues of late, Chinese growth rate, for example, has declined. What it used to be since the late 1970s, double digit growth, almost touching double digit growth, has kind of declined. But for whatever reason, it has offered deeper market access to India, to Brazil, and to the other BRIC countries, investments in infrastructure, diplomatic cover in forums from the WTO to the UN. Now, for India, the shift is particularly symbolic. For 2 decades, Washington quoted in New Delhi as, the democratic counterweight to Beijing, which I pointed out. Successive American administration, they pushed and they promoted defense deals, intelligence sharing, and Indo-Pacific strategy papers to bind India to the West. There is a whole list of it. When Dr. Manmohan Singh was the prime minister and President George W. Bush number 2, when he was the president of the US, the Civilian Nuclear Accord, and several of them. Maybe in a later video, I'll point out the number of the timeline of how the Indo-US relations has kind of changed from 1997 until today. But here, I'm just making this broad point that for India, this has been a real realignment. India used to believe in multi-alignment after the period of non-alignment got over. But in that multi-alignment, it was much more closer to the West, especially America. And that is sort of changing completely. That is the broad point that I wanted to make. With what about the decline of the West? What about the decline of US capitalism, for example? Well, there are several indicators that point out that that is happening, although the right-wing economists argue that the crisis that American capitalism faces because of this era of protectionism, this turbulence caused in the American market because of this entire sort of trade initiatives of President Trump, is kind of being offset by massive American investment in AI technology. But that somehow the left liberal economists do not agree with. Their argument is that the shift is structural in nature, that the decline of American capitalism is really sharp. And, they point out several indicators. For example, in one of the debates, one of them pointed out that the real wages in America has actually declined. At least some figures were pointed out that the real wages of the American worker has declined in the last, let's say, 30 or 40 years. Now, that is something serious, despite the fact that American finance has grown in the same period massively. Whereas in India, I think the reverse is happening. In India and in the BRIC countries, the middle class is gaining extraordinarily. Of course, the farmers and the workers are not sort of surging at the same level, but overall GDP of these BRIC countries is growing. Let me sort of give you some figures straight away, and that may clear some of the points with certain amount of clarity. And let's see if between 2005 and 2020, Washington and New Delhi undertook a series of affirmative technical steps. As I mentioned, the civilian nuclear deal, LEMOA, COMCASA, BECA. These are major defense partnership agreements that build mutual dependence in defense technology and intelligence sharing. Those were incremental bureaucratic investment, low flash high trust moves. By contrast, a sudden tariff imposition is highly visible. 50% we are talking of by President Trump, and it is market hurting and symbolically has changed the entire geopolitics. I'm sort of, in a way, concluding it broadcasts transactional unreliability much faster than can be repaired. In fact, I have a feeling that even after President Trump's period is over, 3.5 years later, this seems to be a rather irreversible sort of change, at least for, I would say, the next decade or so. Um, the BRICS has been actively building institutions and options, from payment system talk to energy and trade linkages that can absorb diplomatic fallout. India sits inside both frameworks, or used to sit inside both frameworks: Western security cooperation and a broader global South grouping. Sharp US policy swings under President Trump in the last 6 months has pushed New Delhi to lean into strategic hedging or to exploit alternative markets. In this case, the BRIC markets, or also, the rest of the world. After all, Africa, Latin America, bilateral sort of relationship with several countries, you will see a major change. The nuclear deal and defense pacts were gestures that told the world that US accepts India as a near peer, a near equal. A tariff stunt by President Trump tells the same world that the US favors transactional coercion, narrative shape alignments almost as much as hardware, credibility, not just capacity, in the currency of alliances. Um, Instead of just running down, finishing I was looking because I had written down certain data. I'm still trying to narrow it down, but maybe in a separate, different video, I'm going to focus more on the figure, or I'll run it while I talk. But basically, there is a personal angle here, by the way. One is what the left wingers pointed out: a structural shift, decline of the West, rise of the rest. That is there, a change in the nature of American capitalism. But at the same time, there is a personal angle here. And that is what I am more interested in. My argument is the following: that elections always had political impact. People who studied the political impact of elections academically would always focus on public finance, how patterns of investment domestically change with the change in the nature of electoral competition. For example, in the US, whenever Democratic administration came to power, they would care more. They would care more about unemployment than inflation. Whereas when Republicans came to power, they would focus more on inflation rather than unemployment. And the reason, what is known as the famous Phillips curve. And the reason is that at one time, the electoral base of Democratic Party was the working class, whereas that of the Republican Party was the middle classes. Today, it's the reverse. President Trump has won because of the MAGA vote. And the MAGA vote is basically largely, not all, but largely white working class, white male working class. The same vote, by the way, which voted President Clinton at one time for the Democratic Party in two successive elections. That has lock, stock, and barrel moved towards President Trump 180 degrees. And that is partly because of the shift of American businesses in a major way to countries like, as I pointed out, Mexico, China, India, Indonesia, and the rest of the world. So there is what I'm pointing out here, the nature of electoral competition, the change in the nature of electoral competition is not only affecting public finance, patterns of investment inside the country, but the very geopolitics. So with the coming of President Trump, a transactional president who came on the base riding the MAGA tiger, and he has sort of changed the entire notion of international trade, made it an issue of economic sanction against countries like India, like Brazil, as I pointed out, and pushed them over to the other camp, which is the BRICS, which some people see as led by China, because China is the largest economy here. But it is not only China, it's a combined economic grouping of developing countries. Remember, it is not a military alliance, quite unlike NATO. It's not. It is simply an economic alliance with certain agenda which President Trump finds irritating, and so would the rest of America. One being de-dollarization, the fact that dollar is the world's currency, the largest currency according to which trade goes on. So the BRIC countries would like an alternative currency. At one time, Chinese wanted the yuan to become the alternative currency. Then there are other opinion there. Sometimes bilateral relationship as between Russia and India sort of follows the rupee-ruble trade, and this is still in the making. It's not, there is no finality there, but these patterns are emerging in a major way. And so that's one. Number two, in a way, bigger trade between the Asian countries. And let me point out that if you take purchasing power parity, in economics, when you measure a country's GDP, gross domestic product, gross national product, you can use conventional terms and purchasing power parity. If you take purchasing power parity as the standard of measurement, then the BRIC countries is actually a larger, the volume of GDP and trade is much larger than that of the G7. If you take the conventional pattern, the G7 still has an advantage, especially in terms of sort of finance, big business, even technology and defense. But when it comes to labor markets, when it comes to, as I said, purchasing power, PPP measurement of sort of volume of trade as well as volume of GDP alternative, add up all the countries, then the BRICS dominate the G7. And the growth of the economies that are inside BRICS, China, Russia, India, Russia, despite the war that is going on with Ukraine, India, of course, Brazil, South Africa. If you look at the patterns in the, let's say, last 20 years, because after all, BRICS was a term that Goldman Sachs sort of very intelligently coined around, let's say, the year 2000. So if you look at the growth since then, it's totally as if there is a decline of the West, there is a rise of the rest. Decline of G7, the rise of BRIC countries. I'm going to stop here, but in a later video, I'll come up with figures showing you how this geopolitical, geostrategic changes are taking place, and I trace it down to domestic electoral competition within the US at this moment. Later on, I will also link it with domestic electoral competition changing, the entire sort of gamut of public policy, even in emerging economies like India. So once more, Trump tariffs, which was supposed to give an advantage to the US, which was supposed to sort of rebuild what I would call America, I would argue has ended up broadly, despite objections by those people who argue that there has been massive investment in the AI sector. But overall, it has led to the decline of the West, and not only led to the decline of the West, but that decline has accelerated under President Trump because of his tariff policies, which I would call is more protectionist than patriotic. Thanks very much.